Hi everyone, welcome to Saris on Screen. I'm Usha,
And I'm Rekha.
and we're talking about politics, patriarchy, and pop culture. Catch us every other Friday as we do feminist deep dives into South Asian culture and cinema. Hello everyone. We're back with another Saucy Deep Dive.
As you know, in these episodes, we take a casual deep dive into a much talked about movie from any part of South Asia, and then we talk about why we loved it or hated it.
Yeah, and then we use our sauce meter to rate it at the end. It's our very own feminist film rating system.
We tried to raise the bar a little bit higher than just the Bechdel.
And hopefully buy enough. But yeah, do check out our blog and our other movie reviews. We do use the system. And we're so excited to finally explore movies beyond both of our comfort zones. I'm Bangladeshi and Rekha's Indian, so we're both essentially stepping out a little bit with this one because this is not a Bangla movie or a Hindi movie.
Yeah, and it's been a treat to explore all these movies from all over South Asia. And in this episode, it's a bit of a mixed bag because it's technically a movie made by the Indian Canadian director Deepa Mehta.
Yep, that Deepa Mehta. For those of us that are familiar, she is the director of the renowned Elements trilogy, or if you've
Mhm.
just seen Fire, she's famous for that.
Yeah, and Funny Boy is really funny because it's a weird movie in that sense because it was made by an Indian director in Canada, and it was an adaptation of a Tamil and Sinhalese Sri Lankan story, but it's now also being shown to American or largely westernized audiences because it's only available on Netflix.
Yeah, so I guess it's like, odd in that way. And so we don't really get representation points on this one exactly. Um,
I
so
mean, neither does Deepa Mehta, to be fair, but I think we'll get into that.
yeah. But yeah, so as we were saying, this movie is an adaptation of a novel which is written by Shyam Selvadurai, a gay Sri Lankan Canadian novelist of Tamil and Sinhalese descent.
Yeah, I think this movie is about this character Arjie and, his journey through childhood and early adulthood. And he's exploring all these boundaries of traditional gender roles and how masculinity is defined and even his economic privilege. But to counteract with that, he's ethnically disprivileged because he's Tamilian in the setting of the Sri Lankan Civil War of the 1980s.
Yeah, and Archie's character is very interesting, I think. He's called Funny Boy over and over, and I think this
Mhm.
speaks to this like overall rigidity of like the gender binaries in our culture and this sort of
Mm.
like the post-colonial everything of our existence. And, like not to use it as a catch-all term, but like, just like how, like the sort of colonial structures of everything sort of define all of these like new sort of gender roles that have come into upper class spaces and everything but and how we're unable to like articulate or put a name to anything that strays outside our expectations of the norm.
Yeah, definitely. And I think to be fair to the movie, it's definitely very subtle and nuanced in that exploration of things that fall outside this very rigid gender binary. And it really does a good job, I think, of portraying the social stigmatization and the fears of ostracization upon being found out, that and the violence that can ensue from just coming out or being found out. And all of these things are like a constant worry for this whole community.
For anyone who's like, hasn't watched the movie, this is not a coming out movie. For
Hmm.
anyone who's worried about that, this is not a coming out movie. And I don't know, like, I really was curious about watching something that felt like, different than like what we
Hmm.
usually watch. And I liked it. Like, I think like portrayals of all the things that Raycom mentioned were definitely like highlights of the movie. Like, and also like Arjie's relationship with his aunt Radha, who's like, this like Canadian like college returnee, and like, who's super vivacious and like open and supportive of his like, like sort of gender explorations and everything. Like, she was such a great character, and there were so many like positive moments in this movie too, like that felt like exciting to watch as well.
Definitely. And I think Radha's character in particular was so nurturing of, that curiosity about gender and
Mhm.
relationships that all of us like kind of go through. And South
Mhm.
Asia is famous for, or infamous for, being super like oppressive about even having those discussions. And so
Mhm.
it was really nice to see this family setup where at least one member of that family was someone that could be a safe space for Arjie.
Mhm.
And I mean, I think the other part of this movie that was interesting was to see, but I feel like it fell short on this part a little bit.
Mhm.
Arjie engaging with like the political aspects of his identity, especially his ethnic identity in Sri
Mhm.
Lanka at that time.
Yeah. It felt short of that, but I think on the other hand it did commentate on like the privilege of Archie's living perhaps. But I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
that was more like, I don't know if that was sort of like a scapegoat on that, Like, oh, like we're going to use like this, like we're going to use privilege as sort of a way to like not get to talk about how RG doesn't really have to interact with like the sort of turmoil that was happening politically at the time. And like
Right.
I think like, we get to see a little bit of that interaction like through like Radha's character, like who is a Sri Lankan Tamil who falls in love with a Sinhalese man,
Mm-hmm.
and their relationship is like very much opposed on like ethnic grounds in their
By both
family.
their
Yeah, by
families,
both their
yeah.
families, yeah. And the romance is cut short when Radha dramatically survives in like an ethnically motivated attack by Sinhalese people, and then she's unable to move past the political and the social connotations of their relationship.
Right.
And yeah, and I think that's the first time we get to see Archie like sort of like remotely interact with any of this, right?
Yeah,
um
even like be indirectly faced with like what that
mhm.
division can cause. And I
Yeah.
mean, it really did leave an impact on him because it was like that lesson that he learned about, exploring unconventional relationships, that it wouldn't work out, that the social sort of opposition to it would be extremely hard to overcome. And it really sets up the second half of the plot where
Mhm.
he's in high school himself and he's exploring his own sexuality and he's going against all of these, heteronormative and social expectations of that
Mhm.
time and place.
Yeah, and we get to see like a little bit of that in high school where Archie is like bullied and everything, like for being like a Sri Lankan Tamil, like in a predominantly like Sinhalese like school and everything. But like we also get to see RG. Like, I mean, I think the high school experience also like, kind of like hyper focused in on like RG's like first romance, which was, very
Mm-hmm.
lovely to see, because I think a lot of queer movies, like coming of age movies, like, they do focus on it, but like, it's very short lived. There's something dramatic that happens very quickly. But I think this movie does, we get to see a lot of it, which I mean, at least a significant chunk of it, which is nice.
Yeah, I mean, his queerness is never like the central like aspect
Mm,
of the movie in that
yeah.
sense, but it does get, I think,
a,
space,
li- a
which
little
is
bit of
like
space, yeah. Like I
yeah.
think there's like, yeah, I think that's true. Like I think this is something that, for anyone who isn't watching or plans to watch, like RG's queerness never takes the front sort of seat on this movie, but there's
Mhm,
enough scenes that were done well. Like I think that's how we would put it. But like, yeah,
definitely.
like I think like RG, we see RG fall in love with the Sinhalese boy in his class called Shihan, and
Mhm.
obviously there are like, political implications of this choice. But on a lighter note, I think, you know I just really adored the chemistry that they had. I don't think of all the movies that we've seen over the past like month, of all the queer movies that we've seen, they had
Right.
the most lovely like sort of chemistry, like the banter and everything. It was just absolutely
Yeah,
perfect.
and there were so
And
many, very cute scenes.
mhm,
Like I
yeah.
and very relatable too. Like,
Yeah.
RG forgetting his book to like share with Shahan so
Yeah.
that they could like sit close to each other. Those are like
Yeah.
cute, dumb things that all teenagers do when they're
Yeah.
crushing on someone.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that like but ultimately the thing is that the political landscape of the era defined a big chunk of their lives and the trajectory of the movie overall,
Right.
and we definitely don't want to spoil the whole movie. And it's a lovely coming of age story, there's no doubt about that, but it's also set to the background of a very dramatic conflict, especially one that isn't like talked enough about.
For sure. I think we both realized when we were researching for this episode and just watching this movie that we know so little about the Sri Lankan ethnic tensions and the Civil War, despite both of us having grown up in South Asia.
Yeah, and I think it's a shame that despite all of this being such recent history, we spent like all of our lives just being fed either like just super hyper focused narratives about our own countries or the West. Like just,
Right.
like it was just either this or that. And I really wish that this was something that was discussed more frequently. It's just sad because we've all been impacted by the same exploitative policies under colonization with exacerbated ethnic conflict all over the subcontinent.
Yeah, and I mean, even in our own process, like this, I mean, I want to know this to become a better, more like well informed individual,
Mhm.
obviously, but also in terms of like our research for this episode, we usually spend weeks trying to make sure we have as many sources as possible and we're bringing as much information and knowledge as possible to our conversation. But to be honest, in this episode, we just don't feel comfortable speaking specifically about the political aspects of this, which we agree is a really shitty thing to do, to not take like a
Mhm.
stance. And I mean, obviously, impartiality is a luxury we get to like indulge in right now. And we totally acknowledge that. But I think it's just really stemming from our own lack of objective knowledge regarding all of this.
Yeah, or just talking about it at all. I think like it's just very hard to speak on something that is, such a sensitive topic. And I think we're deeply apologetic for this. But in our, sort of research, it was definitely like hard to find something that we could, just really like be like, oh yeah, this is it, and we can like forward it, and speak on it and be like, yeah, we'll be like, we're very
Yeah, we
comfortable
know,
like,
we get this
yeah,
now.
we
We
get this now, like it's very recent, and then the thing is that it's quite fresh as far as like history goes, and there's been years of trauma for this country over this conflict, millions of lives lost and displaced. There are over millions of Sri Lankan Tamil people living abroad now, and there's just so much trauma around this topic. It has a violent recent past and complications that would require just so much more research than we could undertake for like an episode of this scale. And we
mm.
just did not feel like it would be our place to comment on it, especially while knowing so little.
And I mean, we really welcome any resources that you could forward to us and like just reading about this issue in general
Mm-hmm.
more. I think we're trying to learn more about this and maybe we'll reach out to people who are more informed than we are to get some more context on this. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
we'd really appreciate any other sources that any of our listeners could send into.
Yeah, absolutely. And if there's anything that we say that's, insensitive, or like if we say something that's wrong, like, like we are like please send us an email. Like we will be happy to make any edits to this episode and like, make changes. Like we absolutely understand that, like that can happen. Like we're human, we can make mistakes. We'll try not to like comment on anything like that we don't know, but yeah, feel free to email us, DM us, anything. We're always accessible. But yeah, we just wanted to do this disclaimer before we started. We normally don't condone doing a historical analysis of stories or films, but we'll do our best in trying to contextualize the queer themes and in the cinematography in this movie without making assumptions on a topic we aren't well versed on. And that's the best that we can hope to do for this. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think especially for me doing this episode has been like a realization, like an introspective realization on multiple levels. And I feel particularly, sad to admit that I actually went to Sri Lanka like maybe 6 years ago, 5, 6 years ago. And this ethnic conflict and the whole thing just never even occurred to me because I was a tourist there. I mean, I also didn't have the political engagement or like knowledge to even do anything. I think the only narrative I had at that point of the ethnic tensions was like this, whatever, Indian, like standard education board like version of it, which pretty much like glorified us and like just talk shit
Mhm.
about the rest of the people.
Yeah, no, I think that like it is very sad that like conversations in South Asia like politically will be so dominated by like India Pakistan politics
Oh
and like
yeah.
nothing else. Yeah, and I think like that happens in like so many like layers, right? Because like I think coming from a small country in like South Asia, like
Hmm.
when we're in Bangladesh, we're sort of fed like, oh, first you get Bangladeshi news, then you get Indian news because you have to, because you have to always know if India's got or something, like or something like or
Right.
India's for or something like something or the other. I don't know if I have to cut that out, like something like I'll bleep that out because like that is how it works. But yeah, like you never know what's happening in terms of like like you have to know what's happening in India, and like I think that's something. And then you get the Western news, but you never get to know, like you're never taught to prioritize news that's from like anywhere else, right? And I think like like I wouldn't expect someone from Sri Lanka to know some what's happening in Bangladesh, but like that's also like a sad thing, right? um but that but yeah, well, that also brings in that conversation of like Indian like sort of like
Hegemony.
hegemony over like sort of our media and like news cycles also, right? And I think this hegemony thing, like I know, like it's like it sounds like harsh, but I mean, it kind of plays out even in terms of this movie a little bit. As we mentioned, this movie was adapted by Deepa Mehta, and it was originally like Shyam Selvadurai novel, which came out in 1994 and is like a highly esteemed queer South Asian novel and often read in queer and marginalized study courses, and whatnot. It's super spiffy. And while the author may have been part of the movie's script writing process, there are points where we wondered whether his voice and story were done complete justice in the adaptation.
And I mean, just to note here, like we haven't had a chance to read the novel yet, which we've heard is really great in terms of just exploring and portraying queerness. But I mean, that has its own, like, probably issues. And we won't be commenting on the novel itself, just the movies very specifically. And I
Mhm.
mean, the movie, in terms of representations, I feel like had a lot of problems. Like, just simply the fact that this was a movie centered around like a Sri Lankan Tamil family, but there
Mhm.
were barely any Sri Lankan actors in it. I mean, you were telling me, right, Usha, that
Mhm.
the the actress who plays Radha is like Punjabi Canadian
Yeah,
or
that's like
something.
it's like yeah, like when we were like prepping for the script, I kept calling her the Punjabi aunt. It was like she is the Punjabi aunt. She's Punjabi Canadian. Then the other actors, like I think the dad is Pakistani.
Hmm.
And then the mom is I think from Sri Lanka. I think one of the few actors from Sri Lanka, and the Arjie is Sri Lankan descent, but not Tamil Sri Lankan. Arjie is a burger, but Arjie is gay. I guess Deepa Mehta can pat herself on the back on that one.
I mean,
But
she essentially
she
did.
is. She is
She
very
did,
much.
like.
Like I hope she doesn't break her hand patting herself on the back on that one. Um, but the thing is that like it's very odd. And the thing is that Deepa Mehta has been interviewed on this,
Hmm.
and she has said that, oh yeah, well, like like these Tamil diaspora actors, Tamil Sri Lankan diaspora actors, they have visa problems. A lot of them, I mean, yeah, like a lot of them are on refugee visas. They have visa problems. Sure, Deepa Mehta, all that. A lot of them don't want to play queer roles, but like Deepa Mehta. There's only like two queer, like two or three queer characters in the entire movie. I don't know what your point is. Like, there's multiple other characters who could have been cast who aren't like queer. So, like, I mean, this isn't even the conversation we had on the previous episode, right? Like, where it's like, oh yeah, it's hard to get like marginalized people to play queer roles. And like, this keeps coming back to that same issue, right? Like, where it's like, these are privileged directors
Absolutely.
who are not making the effort. No, and I think like what made it super shitty on top of all of this is that the initial movie that came out, like the when the trailer came out, like the Sri Lankan Tamil people, they realized that the Tamil that was spoken in the movie was barely intelligible. Like it
Yeah.
could not be understood. I'm like, that sounds ridiculous. Like you can't have had one person on set who was like, hey, like this is not working. No one understands what the fuck they're saying. That just goes to show how little you give a shit about like whose story you're profiting off of, right?
And I mean, I think even as someone who doesn't understand Tamil, all the Tamil dialogues felt very like inauthentic or like just
Mm-hmm.
out of sync at some points.
Yeah,
Like,
it felt like, I don't know, like just like to sort of complete that thought, like they it was so bad that this controversy with the language that they, after the trailer came out, she had to get this movie redubbed. Like, and so like
my
I'm
God.
like, that sounds absurd. How cocky do you have to be to put out a movie without getting it checked by someone who actually speaks like Sri
And this
Lankan
is
Tamil?
supposed to be like an Oscar nominee.
This was an Oscar contender. But yeah, no, like I think it's just ridiculous that like you end up making a movie essentially like selling these people's stories, and then you can't be bothered to like even get their language right. And
It's
then
so offensive.
yeah, it's so offensive. And then Deepa Mehta told The Wire that the entire controversy was quote unquote defensive and demeaning. And then
Oh
she
wow.
added, do you want your story to be told? The story of genocide of the Tamils? Or
Oh
is
my
it
God.
more important to you that that a Sri Lankan Tamil who is not a Tamil is playing a Tamil? People want to be so offended these days. It's very easy to be offended, but I did not set about offending anybody. It's the last thing I need in my life. Been there, done that, and it's exhausting. Yeah, but that is a quote.
Oh my
I
gosh.
like that is a quote from The Wire. I'm not making this up. But yeah, no, it is ridiculous that you feel that entitled to like like all of this. I mean, kudos to Deepa Mehta for like, telling queer stories for South Asia when, other people
Nobody
weren't.
told them.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
yeah, and being able to sell it, like other people were telling queer stories, Deepa Mehta sold it. Let's not, like,
Yeah.
yeah, Deepa Mehta was able to sell it. But the thing is that I think it's just so weird, because like we've been like, and there's other element to this, right? That like the Ilam Tamil diaspora was very upset because they're like Deepa Mehta also cooperated with the Sri Lankan government when making this movie. And I don't I don't know like to what degree she needed to cooperate specifically,
Right.
but clearly if you have to like cooperate with the same people who are responsible for the oppression of the people whose story you're milking, I don't know, and if they're offended by the amount of cooperation that you did, then I don't know, like I don't know, there's just so many layers of disregard. It
And
just
I mean, yeah, I think it
beyond
really
casting, like like beyond casting, there's just so many layers of disregard, and it just feels, it leaves a poor taste in your mouth. Like,
definitely. And I think like it really makes you think because this like I read this other article about how like Deepa Mehta and like the rest of the directorial team were like super gung ho about making sure that a queer person was cast like in Arjie's like role and everything. Which is like nice. Like that's great. Like we want queer people to be able to play queer people or
mm-hmm,
just appear in movies. But also
Mhm.
like it really kind of begs that question, is like, where do we draw the line, and how are we like ranking or like hierarchizing what representation is important and what isn't, or what representation isn't required and what is? And I mean, these are
Mhm.
all obviously artistic choices,
Yeah.
but I mean, I think it's ultimately just really awful that a story about like the Sri Lankan Tamil community is being told by a director of North Indian descent who
Mhm.
currently lives in Canada. And she's
Mhm.
not even bothering to fully represent their language or their culture, and also casting like non Sri Lankan people.
Yeah, no, and I think it's just like, really brings us to that sort of expectations that we have from these sort of sensitive and artistic directors who, like, want to tell stories from marginalized, like, perspectives, right? And, like, the sort of, like, also, like, savior complex that they all seem to kind of have.
Mm,
I mean, like, not to be like, I mean, I know we sound kind of catty on this, like we get it. Like Deepa Mehta is a super prestige director, but so is Shonali Bose. So is Lena Yadav. Like all of these directors are super prestigious. But like the thing is that like Shonali Bose, when we watch Margarita with the Straw, like she didn't cast a differently abled actor to play the main characters, right? She didn't. And we know how hard it is for disabled actors to break into the industry, and so
absolutely.
it's super shitty when when like directors with so much privilege don't use their platform and their privilege to create access and employment for marginalized peoples while making money off of their lives. Or looking at Lena Yadav in like Parched, when she made like a fantasy poor Indian village without clearly wanting to employ or consult, or actually represent actual poor women's stories. And it's like, sure, has she made documentaries in the past? Sure. But also, like, it's a fantasy. It's an upper class feminist fantasy, right? And
Yeah.
ultimately, you're milking stories for profit for upper class Western gazes,
And
and you
these
don't
are
want to employ or you don't care about the people whose story you are actually telling. And I think that it's just shitty.
absolutely. And I think, I mean, these are really prestigious, privileged people. And I would expect anyone who has any kind of privilege to be consciously aware about what it is, how it plays out, and like how it manifests in a savior complex. So, and I get it. Like, I mean, of course, we're all people, and I mean, none of us know everything about everything. So there are going to be issues that we're disconnected from. And there are all these biases, whether it's ableism, classism, casteism, or anything else that we won't be able to represent fully. But also just being like consciously aware that that's what you're doing, that you're biased. I mean, I feel like what really irks us as viewers is that like none of these people seem to want to take responsibility when they're called out.
Mhm.
And I think
Mhm.
our role as engaged and active viewers is also to like actually do that calling out, because otherwise we're never going to hold these people accountable for all the damaging narratives that they might be putting out there. And I
Mhm.
think with this movie specifically, another element that kind of just doesn't sit right with me is the fact that Deepa Mehta is from North India. And
Mhm.
this is like, the North Indian entitlement towards all cultures in South Asia,
Mhm.
in particular South Indian culture, because I mean, there's been so much,
Yeah.
linguistic oppression and cultural oppression in that
Hmm.
sense there
Yeah, I
too.
think it makes it almost even more insulting that she didn't care that the language is off in the trailers, Like
Exactly.
it's almost even more offensive coming from Deepa Mehta than anybody else. And like And I think like her being a Western, like Indo-Canadian, like, because she's not just North Indian, she's an Indo-Canadian director. She's been in
Right.
Canada for the last 50 years, not to rob her of her heritage. But this whole attitude of like, I don't care who I offend, I think there's a difference, Deepa Mehta, like when you say like, I don't care if I offend conservatives who are offended that I made a
Yeah,
lesbian movie.
exactly.
Like, because yeah, there is a difference when you are offending people who are like they're moral blah blah blahs
Or they're like
versus when
super aggressive
yeah,
themselves.
yeah,
Yeah,
versus when you're offending the people whose story you're trying to tell. Like, there's a difference. I think there is a very big difference, and if you're unable to see that, I think you've been huffing your own, fucking like air too much, you know but yeah, like that entitlement is, I think, what's been our problem with this whole thing. And not to like sort of shirk Deepa Mehta's credibility or talent as a director, but that sort of behavior makes it really hard to swallow as a good movie. And like, just generally speaking, like, just going back to that entitlement, like, but yeah, I just kind of wanted to talk about, like, Bollywood just overall having this sort of like hegemony, like, and we keep using this word, I get it, but like Bollywood feeling like they're entitled to sort of making and remaking stories from other parts of South Asia and
definitely.
co-opting like cultural imagery and like, like even just like words and songs and like just like bits and pieces and like fragmenting like other parts of like cultural heritage from other parts of South Asia and indigenous cultures in South Asia
Mhm.
without ever like crediting it or like, just monetizing it and just never doing it justice and just, make, profiting off of it,
Just
right?
appropriating like
Yeah, it's
South
just very
Asian culture.
appropriative. It's just very shitty. And like, and all under like, that sort of like, oh yeah, we're gonna all put it under the Hindi.
Pluralist culture, like
Mm-hmm.
whatever,
Yeah,
whatever.
and it's very, I mean, there's obviously a
Smorgasbord.
big like nationalistic political element to this, but whether it's like, Gain the Fool, like, or like, Bollywood trying to make a movie about, a terrorist attack that happened in Bangladesh like after a month that it happened.
Oh my
Um
god.
but whatever it is, Bollywood has had a history of, feeling like it's entitled to sort of everything else that happens in South Asia. And it's, and it always comes with this like sort of shitty tone, right? If, it's always like, aren't you glad that someone like us, someone so big, decided to make a movie about this? It's always that sort of like, aren't you grateful? Like, it's like what Deepa Mehta said, like, aren't you glad it was being done at all? Why are you
Right.
squabbling over like the little bits,
Yeah, and I think to pull that thread like a little further, like, and just explore that entitlement a little bit more, I think we have to also like just realize that this North Indian entitlement is deeply entrenched in that historical context of North Indian privilege, which is pretty much as old as like the caste system and, the Aryan invasions and the oppression of like indigenous people in the subcontinent. And I mean, to be fair, caste does exist in the southern parts of India, and but that's like a whole other discussion that we should take up on a
Mhm.
later date. And I think we see this sort of, I mean, this north south hierarchy in present day Bollywood outside of the stories themselves, because I mean, there's all this colorism against actors and actresses from other parts of India who don't fit into that,
Mhm.
fair and lovely, like, sort of mold, pretty much. And in particular, the South. And even though regional actors can make it in Bollywood, or they will, like, I mean, they can become somewhat famous, they're still usually still, relegated to these supporting roles and like as side characters. And Bollywood is like this nepotistic like hellhole of like rich upper caste North Indian people, which just makes it that much harder for like anyone who doesn't fit into those like demographics to make it anywhere at all, I think.
And I think think another problem with this sort of amalgamating of stories from, whether it's Bollywood or Hollywood or like, anything for central global consumption is the issue of like reorientalization. And this is when like South Asian artists or writers or directors will sort of mystify and reorientalize themselves for like Western consumption. Right.
Mhm.
And, this, is sort of the result of like neocolonialism and this sort of pressure that it poses on our identity sort of to become this sort of one like big ball again, for like it's easy to consume, that's
I
easy
think
to
it's
like.
also a big like thing within like diasporas as well
Mhm.
because of
Yeah.
like their own like cultural sort of like dilemmas, I think,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, no, like I think it becomes like, a lot of diaspora books will see this a lot, right? Because a lot of diaspora books, you won't be specifically like you'll mention your Indian, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, XYZ, whatnot, but you'll only mention attributes that are like easily recognizable to a white audience as being like
South Asian.
Asian. And like, I
Yeah.
mean, we see that with like our programming, right? Like we are branding as like a South Asian podcast, right? And like that's not, partially for marketing, partially for, whatnot. But we realized that it would be a lot harder to market as, a Bangladeshi podcast, or even like a New Delhi, South, like South, like South Delhi podcast, or
Oh
like a,
my
or
gosh.
like a,
I'm not a
or
South Delhi podcaster. Oh my gosh.
but it would be really hard to brand that way. It's a lot easier to brand when you can just be like, oh yeah, like turmeric monsoon and like chai on my like ginger chai, right? Like, and like occasionally like spritz in a few words here and there. Like my baba said, like go do your,
I mean,
like
we are
yeah.
called saris on
Yeah,
screen.
we are called saris on screen. We understand that we are part of the reorientalization problem to a degree of, but the thing is that, so is Funny Boy, so we are point the fingers right back. This movie was Canada's entry into the Oscars, not even Sri Lanka's, not even India's.
Oh
Like
my
it was
gosh, that's
literally
so
Canada's entry
hilarious
into the
to me.
Oscars. And it's funny because it was rejected for not having enough foreign language in it, which
Oh
was
my god.
like lol. Like after all of Deepa Mehta's like like dubbing and shit and everything, like she couldn't like, gibberish Tamil and dubbing and everything, like she couldn't get into the Oscars. um
Yeah, and I think, I mean, this movie did have that whole, like, monsoon and my mother's warm turmeric chai and, like, very, like, Ruby Core. I mean, I feel like Ruby Core did it, like, reorientalizes less than this movie did, honestly. But I mean, I think that tends to be the vibe with a lot of these, whether it's movies, books, or, like, just these diaspora slash immigrant stories sometimes that they're
mhm.
being packaged for this Western audience. And as a South Asian person consuming like a South Asian story packaged for a Western audience, I think it's very like, I don't know, it feels very mixed. I think like
Mhm.
there's not a lot like
Yeah. No, I think there's like I think also another part of it that kind of feels a little weird. I think it's in the dialogue or how it's presented, that it's like a neoliberal fantasy, right? That sort of rainbow washing of like the magic west that exists where you can be gay freely, where there's no ethnic tension, there's no, in the other movie, in the other books, there's no Islam, there's no shitty dad, there's no, mommies with like, gender roles, there's only the cool aunt from Canada, right?
I think also the
There's like
rainbow washing of like our
mm,
own privilege, right? Because
mm-hmm,
like all of us like to pretend we exist in these like, very socially correct and politically correct circles where
mm-hmm,
everyone's very open. But it's actually like, middle class and upper middle class, like sort of socioeconomic backgrounds that are often the most prejudiced and the most oppressive to people
mm-hmm.
within their own families too.
Yeah. And I think that, like it's also the fact that these privileges don't just pop out of like nowhere. They're often the result of like, exploitations, like, within the country. And
Yeah.
neoliberalism is like, more like, global sort of exploitation. But even our privileges are like a result of, like, exploitation within the country. Like, you're rich because somebody else is poor. That is
Pretty
always how
much.
it is. And I think that, that aside, like, not to brush past it, but I think, another thing that, this is like cinematographically, like, this movie fell prey to that sort of yellow tones thing that often Western movies will do for South Asia. Like, the tropics are yellow, it's warm, it's like,
There are
it's
coconut trees everywhere.
there's
Yeah.
coconut trees everywhere, and it's yellow, and it's all, tray oriental, and there's, I think there's just like very, their identities are very decentered to Sri Lanka, and they're kind of living peripherally to, like, all of the sort of
There
ethnic
the
tension, right?
country.
Because
Yeah.
it's always like Arjie's life and then cutting away to like ethnic tension, Arjie's life cutting away to ethnic tension.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of like colonial aesthetic, these like palaces, their outfit. I think like in the Arjie's dad is always in these like sort of colonial hunting gear type of like outfits, like British colonial officer type of outfit,
Even their
which I get.
accents are like super. I mean, their accents are really hot, but they're also like very post-colonial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, I get that there's some historical remarking in these areas, but then it's always like, I don't know, like,
Romanticized.
but there's
Yeah.
always like just enough Sri Lankan things for the aesthetic of it all, like, they're Sri Lankan just enough so the Western audience is like, oh yeah, it is Sri Lanka. Look,
It's
there's
a
palm
foreign
trees,
movie.
there's
Yeah.
coconut trees, it's a foreign movie. But yeah, like, I think, there's no conversation around orientalism without mentioning Edward Said. And this isn't our
Obviously.
like, big episode, but like, I think, to say like, orientalism depends for its strategy on this flexible positional superiority, and in a whole series of possible relationships with the Orient, without ever losing him the relative upper hand. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that, in this sort of new world that we live in, like, the this sort of control has sort of gone, in terms of the voice of who controls, like, this sort of orientalist narrative. It's gone from the sort of, sorry, white men still have orientalist narratives. So do diaspora South Asian women, and so do diaspora South Asian gay men. And there's a conversation around this that we're not willing to have, about how they will often, do these sort of totalizations and generalizations about the culture, about these sort of places that, not, again, we're not trying to take away anyone's heritage or their claims to heritage, but they often serve as sort of voices of these entire subcontinents
Yeah, and
for the
there's
West,
no
you know?
like universal South Asian
Hmm.
experience, right? There's
Yeah.
not even probably a universal Bangladeshi or Indian or
Mm-hmm.
like Pakistani
Yeah, like, I
experience.
wouldn't want to speak about the 5 blocks that I grew up in. There's too many types of lives there, right? Like, it
Literally.
would be, I wouldn't try to be like a authority on it. And I think that, there's something a little off when, when you like tell a story, and then at the author bio, you'll be like, like with Funny Boy, it's like, the novelist, he specifically kept on saying, oh
That
yeah,
it's
this is
not
not,
like
it's not autobiographical, it's not autobiographical. And many of these authors tend to do this over and over, that it's not autobiographical. But also,
it kinda is.
he is a gay Canadian, um
Sri Lankan.
Sri Lankan Tamil Sinhala novelist who did move to Canada at 19, just like Arjie. Right. And so maybe it's not autobiographical, but let's not admit that when you hear that, that makes you think that this book or this movie is a little more credible once you know that detail. And they do push that detail, whether it's Deepa Mehta, when when you read the bio of the movie and it's like, well, like, oh yeah, it's adapted from a story. who of this person, and it's like, oh yeah, this automatically lends Deepa Mehta, and Deepa Mehta claiming credibility from somebody else is already a little more insidious.
Mm-hmm.
But it is, but this is the problem with sort of reorientalization, is that you end up sort of being the only point of reference to South Asia for a lot of the West. And
Mm-hmm.
you are publishing in the West, you are on a Western platform, Netflix, wherever, and you will use it to sort of make generalizations.
And like ultimately, I think like when you try to like present your experiences as speaking for the larger like population, or like just trying to universalize your experiences, what ends up pretty much happening is, you know, a reductiveness of that entire culture, of that entire like
Mhm.
social setup and language. And I think that, I mean, we expect that from like Western authors or Western
Mhm.
filmmakers, but when it happens from like someone who is South Asian, who maybe understands the complexities and
Mhm.
nuances of South Asian identity, I think it's even more disappointing,
Mhm.
because you expect these people to at least bother to understand like their
Yeah.
own like community, you know?
Yeah. Or I mean, yeah, or like even try to like cross check with their own community, right? And I mean literally language, because Deepa Mehta did not give a shit about the language.
She's like, no one at the Oscars is gonna be able to tell what the Tamil
Yeah.
sounds like.
Uh, but yeah, but the Oscar people were gonna be able to tell the English, and I think this brings us to our like next point. Um
Yeah, and I think like English and like just reorientalism and English as like a part of this movie played such an interesting role too. And just how it was used in the movie. And I think we see this across like a lot of South Asian media, where English is often a tool for social commentary on class or socioeconomic inequalities. And I think if you've been with us from the start, and if you've heard our first episode, we talked about this in the context of Sir as well, where
mhm.
English was used to alienate the main character, who's a domestic worker, and sort of like clarify that very obvious hierarchy
Mhm.
and power dynamic. And
Yeah.
I think it's similar, because the first time we hear English in Arjie's house is when he's playing with his friends, and the women in his family are like in this like living room area, and they're instructing their domestic workers, and like getting like head massages and I don't
Mhm.
know whatnot, really privileged stuff. And
Mhm.
then they just like literally switch to English when they want to talk among themselves.
Mhm.
And like the domestic workers are now suddenly supposed to be, you know, like they're supposed to turn deaf essentially
Yeah.
when they hear English, right?
Yeah, no, and I think like English is, is almost a character of its own both in and out of the movie, because like it
Mm-hmm.
has so many functions. It's not only used to represent the character's privilege, but outside of the movie, it's also representative of the audience's privilege in a sense, because the majority of the people who like watch the movie are English educated upper class, upper caste South Asians or diaspora South Asians or just the Western audience, right? And it comes through in the storytelling that the movie isn't intended for the people that it's about. And I think that, we mentioned this in case of Sir as well, that even though the main character is a domestic worker, that domestic workers were never meant to be the primary audience of the movie, and that it was largely intended for people who employ domestic workers and was meant for them to reflect on their behavior and their role in perpetuating like inequality, rather than like
The people it was
the
about. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and I think this is like a recurring theme that we've been getting like over and over, like all these sort of upper class directors, upper caste directors telling
Mm-hmm.
marginalized story telling this telling marginalized stories, but not for marginalized people, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the other like part of the other interesting part of English in this movie is how it's like this colonial backdrop and aesthetic to like their attire, their household, and even maybe like just to give some credit to the director here, maybe like some historical commentary on their access to education and their socioeconomic privilege, despite being like in a minority ethnic group in that
Mhm.
context.
Yeah, and I think that we weren't able to understand how bad the language work was in this movie, but it can be assumed that a certain amount of conflict was presented when the two groups that spoke Tamil and Sinhala um wouldn't communicate like with each other like in those languages, and could only find mid grounds to talk via English.
That's like the story of so much of South Asia, right?
Mhm.
That like so many people who maybe, maybe just like a few hundred miles apart, like probably can't communicate in each other's native languages, and therefore English becomes
Mhm.
that medium. And I mean,
Yeah.
it's a colonial relic that has played a huge role in not just instigating and furthering ethnic tensions in Sri Lanka and the rest of South Asia, but it's also now turned into this like mediating presence in like, between ethnic or linguistic differences for the entire
Yeah.
subcontinent.
Yeah, it's trying to like sort of make like do with a sort of terrible situation, like almost like like you've
Mm-hmm.
give been handed like a sort of like horrible thing, and you kind of try to make use of like it, like the best you can. It's almost like a post-colonial reclaiming of it for and I don't know if it's like a sort of a reach kind of, because it was very pointed in the movie, and like how it was symbolized in contrast to like other depictions of the language so far. We see it in Radha's relationship when she's dating the Sinhalese man, or Arjie is dating Shehan, and
Mm.
English becomes this sort of language to love across ethnic lines, and across heteronormative expectations.
Yeah, and I mean, even like Arjie's dad, like we see him, like his role, like in terms of the political context, was kind of interesting. Where he was I think his mom was shown to be a little bit more rebellious, but Arjie's dad was very much like, like I just want to keep my head down, get through the day, like mind my own business, essentially, very apolitical in that sense. But
Hmm.
I mean, he also uses like English to like talk to people for his business. All of their like
Hmm.
friendships and social interactions seem to
Hmm.
take place like majorly in English, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like it ultimately comes back to the fact that like English in South Asia, or even in this movie, like this is still for the upper class, and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of these luxuries of accessing love or mediation or business across ethnic lines, or other divisions, only seems to be reserved for the rich, because a lot of these privileges of like a lot of these anything is just for the rich at the end of the day. And if the movie has done a good job of done something, it is to sort of commentate on that.
I mean, but also just to be fair again, like I mean, Deepa Mehta did make this for like a Western
Yeah.
audience. So
Yeah.
English being
Yeah,
like
there's yeah.
there's like a problematic aspect of English
Mhm.
being like the
Yeah.
main, like there's obviously like artistic credit that she should
Mhm.
receive for like
Mhm.
how the
Yeah, it's a
language is.
double-edged sword on that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, because she's at the same time limiting like the majority of the subcontinent from like finding this movie accessible, right?
Yeah. But the one thing that the movie did really well was its little representations of like, queer experiences, especially in this, sort of coming of age period.
And
Yeah.
I think we see that in how, like, for RG, like, most of his safe spaces are shown to be like the women in his family. Though his
Mhm.
sister is, I think, like, kind of like homophobic and stuff. But his
Mhm.
mom and his aunt Radha are like shown to be a lot more like comforting and like just understanding than his dad and his brother. His brother Diggy is like very conventionally masculine, and his dad like pretty much wants him to fit into that role as well. And I mean, we see this pretty much from the first scene.
Mhm.
RG sort of like exploration of that gender, or trying to just break out of the gender binary, because in the first scene he's being like reprimanded by all of his family members because he wanted to play the bride when they were like playing like a wedding game or something. And
Mhm.
even though his friends were like, "Oh yeah, you're the best bride," all these adults are like, "Oh no, you're a funny boy. You're like, you should play cricket, you should play tennis, and like this is what
Mhm.
girls do and shit." Like,
Yeah. But to the degree that the queer subplots did exist, we see a lot of romance and love, and RG's sort of idealistic look at the world as a queer child, which was, nice to see. And, as we were talking about it, like we love the relationship between RG and Shihan, which was, short lived, but they really showed some of the important experiences that queer South Asians go through, and that some of the key things that queer kids in general might go through in terms of like acceptance and receiving love, and the sort of like self-doubt and fear of navigating spaces, in our homes in general, without like, outing ourselves, like how do you do like self-expression without, being like wearing a rainbow flag, like just like all of that, like, and it's interesting because the story wasn't centered on coming out, which I like, which was very nice to see, because like I'm always excited to see South Asian queer stories that aren't very Western, centered on Westernized coming out. Yeah.
yeah, but he was like outdid though, unfortunately.
Yeah, he was
Like
caught.
RG,
Yeah, he
yeah, he
was
was caught by
caught
his
by his
dad,
dad.
like when
Mm-hmm.
his brother pretty much like egged his dad on because his brother knew that RG was into Shahan, and I
Mm-hmm.
guess his brother was also homophobic. And yeah, I mean, I did like that it wasn't a coming out story, unlike
Mm-hmm.
some of the other movies that we watched for like our last episode. But
Mm-hmm.
it is still like a it's still a queer romance. I would still call it a queer
Mm-hmm.
romance that's been very nicely contextualized to the setting and time period it's in. And
Mm-hmm.
it's nice that like a queer story isn't all about coming out, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that, we get to see a lot of the sort of like other South Asian elements of this, where RG felt the need to end his relationship to like appease his family, and that sort of pressure that like, oh, I could just be normal and just like, that I could
Yeah.
just get swallow this and move on with this, that like that happens to all of us. We all thought that, we could just, be normal, right? And and like I think there are lots of like bits where the filmmaking, sort of was, good, like, they foreshadowed all of this with, through Radha's experiences, and how she ended up sort of chose normal, right?
Mhm.
She ended up marrying her family approved, like, person, like, of similar ethnic background, and and she kind of went the family expectations route, but like RG kind of, debated, went through the same feelings, but then RG, decided that not to take Radha's route, right? And there are also like these moments of rebellion, sorry, you should do this.
I also really liked that there were, these moments of rebellion that these characters did, even though again they were small moments, they were still there.
Mm-hmm.
I think I really liked that scene where they're dancing
Mm-hmm.
with their shirts off, and it's like free, like they're
Yeah.
free and liberated. But I mean, also again to contextualize, both RG and Shahan were extremely privileged because they had this space for exploration in the first
Mm-hmm.
place. They both
Yeah.
lived in these like massive houses, and like they
Yeah.
were both from pretty affluent backgrounds.
Yeah.
So, you
Yeah,
know.
I think it's a lot easier. As I mean, we talked about it with like Made in Heaven too, that it's a lot easier to be gay regardless of time period and regardless of, like anything when you have money.
Pretty
Like
much.
it's a like privilege is a hell of a shield, like it
For
can,
sure.
queerness is a disprivilege, but this it works on an amplification basis. But yeah, like it was a good coming of age story on exploring the intersection of class and queerness. But but I don't know, and we, as we were saying, we aren't the best to comment on the ethnic tensions and the intersections that it explored between queerness, class, and that. But it certainly tried, I think, but I don't know how well it did that.
I think the only thing that this movie could get full points for is just like queer chemistry. I think that was
Mm,
probably I mean, and Deepa Mehta is known for like building queer chemistry. So, like,
mm-hmm.
that was at least like not like, something
Yeah.
that she would have failed at. So, at least that's
Yeah.
nice. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I think like this brings us to like another thing that was, like interesting in the movie, in terms of like, we always try to do a little tidbit on the symbology, and this was like, like a small part of the movie. But there were these little bits that were on, like, the kid Archie and the teenager Archie sort of like switching places, and sort of like um there when they were having these sort of like
Hmm.
emotionally overwhelmed moments.
Right.
And it was, like you were talking about, like how, like, there was a very smart use of, like, um
Yeah, I
showing
think as an
emotional, like, yeah, like
narrative tool, it
development.
was
Yeah.
very nice
Yeah.
because, I mean, I think like even as an audience, when you see like, that little kid juxtaposed in like the more adult person's like position,
Mhm.
your heart goes out to him more, and like the dad becomes like an even bigger dick in that moment
Mhm.
because, I mean, it just kind of reminds you that like whether you're like 17 or like 27, getting shit on by your parents is always gonna make you feel like you're
Mhm.
5 years old again.
Yeah, or like the moments where, like, where he's a kid, and like the older RG is like looking at his dad. It's almost like this, like, older RG feeling like sad for his younger self, like
Mm-hmm.
almost like, oh, I wish I could be there for you right now.
Yeah.
Like so many, I think like that's something like a lot of queer people feel. Like when you're older and you like know who you are, and you look back at your like sort of moments of your like child self when you didn't know who you are, and you want
Mm-hmm.
to be there to sort of protect that young version of
And
yourself.
that's like, I feel
Yeah.
like that's such a huge part of like that road to like loving yourself like as a
Mhm.
queer person and
Yeah.
accepting yourself, like, I mean,
Yeah.
I think coming out is hard for sure, but I think most queer people would agree that coming out to yourself is probably like, especially when you come from like, an oppressive culture, coming out to yourself can probably be the hardest thing too.
Mhm. Yeah. And yeah, I think this brings us to sort of our, like, question, like, what impressed you, Ray?
I think we already obviously talked about the queer representation and queer experiences. I think those were done well and they seemed authentic. And for whatever it's worth, I am really happy that like a queer person was playing the main character.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's something. I also think that like RG was given like, I think his queerness, like we mentioned in the beginning, was given space to evolve in the movie, which is
Mhm.
something I
Yeah.
appreciated, that this facet showed like development. And I
Mhm.
think like while it wasn't very directly addressed, that class and queerness intersection is something you can definitely sort of extrapolate from the movie and like
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
such like, media pieces as well.
Yeah. No, yeah, like I think that like I think because of like the sort of biographical nature of the movie, we definitely get to see that based out very well.
Mhm.
For me, I think like what impressed me, like to give Deepa Mehta some credit on this, the subtle,
Finally.
she was very subtle. Her cinematography is always, like does such subtle commentary on like things.
Mhm.
And I think especially like on class privilege, I really like, the sort of the vast high ceilings, the bright colors, and like we were talking about language as a marker of privilege. And then also like, and also just like how it separated them from like everything else. I don't know, part of it felt kind of disjointed, but a part of it also felt like it was commentary. I don't know if that's just like me trying to read it as that, but like it did feel like their privilege was what was separating the frames
Mhm.
more, like, than just like bad
I can see
filmmaking.
that.
Yeah. But like But yeah, no, I also really like the scene, like especially where like the mom, like she like bribes the cops and like the
Mhm.
whole room goes like quiet. And then like, and this whole like other doorway and this like access is created for her and them essentially, because like money
They had the
creates like
money.
accesses, right?
Mhm.
But yeah, like
Very
those moments
literally.
were very well done, and I think those were very impressive. But yeah, and I
Mhm.
think this brings us to like, like what could have been better. um
Which is like maybe a
yeah.
lot of things,
Yeah.
but like we'll try to like keep it
Yeah.
short.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like definitely when you're making a movie or like when you're telling a story that's centered around a conflict, especially for an audience that's not familiar with that conflict, contextualizing it for like a diaspora, a Western, or even a South Asian audience would have been like helpful. I think I
Mhm.
don't think that representation, I don't think there was another side to this story, you know. We
Mhm.
never like really saw what the rest of Sri Lanka, apart from like some prejudiced hateful comments here and there, like was going through at that time. And
Mhm.
I mean, we already discussed this, but like the Tamil language and culture and how it was depicted and used was
Mhm.
very like
Yeah, and
appropriative
like
and
like
clear.
what you were saying is like, like true, like this movie was ultimately not made for Sri Lankan Tamil people. So like
Mm.
if you're gonna make it for other people, at least do a better job of contextualizing the history, right?
Yeah,
Um
like, and like trying to be objective about it, because I think like what happens with this movie is that like at the end I'm kind of like confused about what is it actually trying to say, or what am I supposed to take away from it.
mhm.
Is it about like how hard it is to be queer in Sri Lanka? But I mean, then again, Arjie's queerness is like a subplot and not like the main sort of focus of the film. So is this movie, is it about how hard it is to be like a Sri Lankan Tamil at that specific time? But then it's like a fully one-sided narrative. So everything feels a little like half-assed in that sense.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like, for me like, like one of the things that like also like kind of sat very poorly with me was like the ending scene, which felt very
You
weird
talked
given
about
the
this,
sort of
yeah.
context of the sort of the gaze of the movie and who its intended audience is, very upper class Western audience. And it sort of feeds into their sort of like feeling of class insecurity and shame, as like
Mhm.
I mean like what
I
scene I'm
felt that.
specifically talking about is like, so like what we see is that RG's family, like once, so like what, there's this attack on all the sort of like their compound, essentially this rich family houses in their compound. And so they're all out on the street, and so they're sitting there, they have this sort of gaunt look in their eyes, and they're watching as all these other Tamil people are like sort of lining up to get some water, like in
Mhm.
like, so like I think the rations of water and like food and whatnot. But like RG's mom is dressed, like we've seen her so dressed so elegantly throughout the movie, but here she is now like sitting on the ground, just sadly, and they're still speaking English with their neighbors,
Right, of
and
course.
like, and we see this moment where their neighbors like, oh, you must go back to England, or something, and they're like, oh no, and it's like these are, and the thing is that like it's a very sad moment, right? And the camera sort of pans over all these other people who are like very objectively
Yeah.
worse off than them, who've been here possibly like longer, than
Mhm.
them. And like, and the thing is that like, I don't know, it seemed to sort of focus how separated she seemed from the rest of the sort of like, people,
Refugees and yeah.
refugees, and like the indignity of the predicament rather than the cruelty of it all.
Mhm.
Because this is a very
The
cruelty
class
of,
indignity of
yeah, the
it, like
class indignity of it, right? When this is a very like cruel, awful humanitarian crisis that's being depicted, and it's
right,
almost urging the upper class audience to feel sad for her particularly,
right.
when this is like something, I don't know, like, kudos to Deepa Mehta for knowing who her audience is and tapping into like a very particular emotion there. But also, it feels
Ouch.
odd to
Yeah.
hyperfixate on probably a very small and privileged group in what was a very horrible, violent civil war that led to the death and displacement of millions of people. It felt very just like, I don't know, just left, it was very, it felt odd, and it was in very poor taste.
There were like many aspects of this movie that weren't like as sensitively portrayed as we would have hoped. And like, I think like we've been sort of talking about this in the past as well, that like hopefully as more stories of, marginalized groups, queer people, and all of these communities come to the forefront, we get better representations of these communities as well. And I mean, like we said, I think it's our job to like point out these things so that hopefully whoever decides to do this next, like, just does a slightly better job of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think with that we're ready to give it like our
Scores.
scores on this. Yeah, it was there at least one character who adds a nuanced representation of a diverse South Asian identity without stereotyping and tokenization. Yeah, I gave it a 1. Rekha also gave it a 1. RG is obviously the pick, nuanced representative of,
But to be
everything.
fair, like, I mean, given his ethnic identity, I don't think we would have got like stereotyping or tokenization
Yeah.
in its very
I don't
nuanced
know if we should
form.
give it a zero point 0.5 because he was technically not cast as a Tamil person. I
I
should
mean,
take
we
away.
could, we could,
I
we could just
really want to take it away.
okay. Yeah,
I'm
let's
actually
do.
gonna take it away. I'm gonna give it a zero point 0.5,
So
like
yeah, so that's like
zero point
0.5
five five for
for both.
casting. Yeah,
Yeah.
for casting errors. 0.5 for both of us. Are there primary characters? Especially female and marginalized characters portrayed with agency, individuality, and motivation. I gave it a 1. Rekha gave it a 0.75. I'm just gonna go with the 0.75 for, like, as our like together
Final
score,
score.
final
Yeah.
score,
I
because
give
like,
I took points off just because like yeah, RG is like obviously the main character and he has agency,
mhm.
individuality, and motivation. But also like
He wasn't the
his like
yeah.
story becomes like, a sort of like vehicle for like the rest of the plot in
Mhm.
some ways without
Yeah.
like it being the center, which is why I
Yeah.
just didn't like
Yeah.
yeah.
No, I see that. I see that. But yeah, our third question is, are the female and marginalized characters shown to be cognizant of their identities and how they exist within the social context? Um
But yeah,
No, I
no.
said no because RG seemed to be in a bubble, and I don't think RG really interacts with anything very much. And even when he is like interacting with like this one like character who is like involved very much politically, he just was like, "Oh, I'm sad," or like, "I'm just
Yeah,
gonna go
he's just
back
like
to."
very like apathetic to like
Yeah,
the
he was
politics.
very not involved.
And I think
Uh,
even apart from RG, apart from like the ethnic tensions and that being like a plot conflict, there was like, and we can give like extrapolatory credit to Deepa Mehta for like trying to do commentary in different ways, but there was very little direct engagement that any of the main characters had
mhm.
with their like socio-political identities and like
Mhm.
that context. So yeah,
Yeah,
no.
maybe like Arjie's mom, like a little bit, but like that too, like very
She just
indirectly.
doesn't count enough to like have a point
Yeah,
here though. Yeah, because
yeah,
literally her like rebellion was like telling her husband that, oh, like why aren't you like, more pro like the
yeah,
Tamil Tigers? Like that was
yeah,
like the one
yeah.
bit of like whatever
Yeah.
she added.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think because of that, like, I'm just gonna go with 0. We both go with 0 on this.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, our next question was, do the women and marginalized characters have meaningful relationships with each other? I went with a 1, but like again, I think I'll end up docking 0.25, as with Rekha going for a 0.75. I see it because like ultimately, even though Arjie does have a relationship with Radha, but Radha's gone for the second half of the movie, and then we don't see Arjie really having any other relationships other than the one with Shehan, which also only pops in like very infrequently. Like,
Yeah, and everyone else around him is like constantly like, even his mom, who's like maybe nicer than his dad and his brother, they're still trying to ultimately like not understand him, but just like make him
mm-hmm.
normal. So yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it felt like he didn't have that many like meaningful relationships that were like
Yeah.
directly connected to the plot, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think for our last question, which was, does it challenge any flawed notions upheld by capitalism, patriarchy, and the caste system? I don't know. So, like, I was at a 0.25 before, but after this conversation, I don't know. I feel like I'm just leaning towards a 0. Like, I don't think
Yeah,
it's my
me too.
distaste towards, like, the casting and everything that Deepa Mehta did for this movie, but, like, I just
I
feel
mean, I
like
feel
I
like
don't think it challenged anything. It just
I think even
showed
if it
things.
tried to challenge, I don't think it succeeded. I think it kind of failed because it perpetuated more like, problematic and flawed notions than it
Yeah.
like ended up like working again. So I
Yeah,
feel like
no.
it backfired on itself in that
Yeah, like I know if it's too harsh. I'm gonna give it a 0. Like
sense.
I think I'm at down to a 0
I think
again.
we're like just trying to
Yeah.
make our like
Yeah.
interpretation
Yeah,
of
no,
our
I feel
metric
like this
also
whole
more like.
episode has been very hard to undertake because like Deepa Mehta is such a giant in like sort of queer filmmaking and whatnot. She's not an openly queer filmmaker, which she doesn't owe that to anyone. But like I get why Shyam Selvadurai would feel like very like sort of
I mean, who wouldn't
excited. Yeah,
feel
who
flattered if.
flattered Deepa Mehta wanted to make their like story into like a movie, but
Mhm.
like I don't know, this movie I had such high
I feel like
expectations. Like,
same. I had such high expectations, but it
yeah.
like missed more than it hit for me
Yeah.
ultimately, which is sad.
Yeah.
But
And like
yeah,
yeah, and I almost feel like I as a person, we as people are just unqualified to give Deepa Mehta a 2 stars out of like 5 stars. Like or like a, like 2 out of 5 on our like sauce meter. Like I don't know. Like I just feels like I feel like unqualified as a human. But like I don't know, but this movie really didn't like hit the bars. Like I it didn't.
it's a 2.5. We gave her a 50%.
Yeah, so yeah, like it feels weird to be giving her a 2.5 out of 5. But yeah, we're here. But yeah, I think that marks the end of our episode. We will go self-flagellate on that.
And hope
Um
that she never hears this
so,
episode.
yeah, she won't. I don't think
I
she
mean,
will.
yeah, thank God we're not famous.
Yeah, we will. Thank God we're not famous. But yeah, but yeah, hopefully, even if we get famous, we can like quickly wipe. um, but
Wipe this
um,
off the
but
internet.
no, like I
Yeah.
mean, no. Jokes aside, no. If we were to get famous, we'd want like we'd want some of these thoughts like
We'd
out there.
hope that like she took this as constructive feedback, like pretty
Yeah.
much. If despite
um.
all the random jokes, that's pretty much all it
Yeah.
is.
But yeah, no, I think that I think jokes aside and everything, if we'd love it if you would share and all that jazz. But thank you all for tuning into this episode of Stars on Screen. Make sure to subscribe and drop us some feedback on our socials, and drop us recommendations for any movie you'd like for us to tackle in the next deep dive. And we'll be back in 2 weeks with our next episode discussing non consent and how it's glorified through our media. And we're available anywhere that podcasts are platformed. Bye!